Welcome to Speak Sex. This is Eve Eurydice or Eurydice Eve, same person. And I want to give you an introduction to what Speak Sex is about and the topics that I think are most vital right now that I am asked about a lot. And I have a different spin on that I think makes sense for the 21st century. The 2020 looking forward era that I call the post-patriarchy. So basically, I divide human history as we know it, the type of human history we have access to, putting aside our bias of like what we can actually understand from the discoveries and the data and the archaeological findings. I divide history into pre-patriarchy, patriarchy, and post-patriarchy, which is the era we're in now, and the reason we have so much confusion about how to be a man, how to be a woman, how to date, how to love, how to interact, how to exchange, what to exchange, both in terms of intimacy, emotions, trust, commitment, fidelity, and in issues of financial support, exchange of money, and consent. And finally, all of our questions about what really has feminism achieved for women and for men, and is there a place in today's confusing, chaotic arena, stage, where men and women still meet and try to love and mate and become one. Is there a place in all of that still for like motherhood and fatherhood? How does that all work out? So this is going to be a very quick introduction, and then I can release more information. But basically, in nature, things have always happened a certain way and continue to. And what does change a lot is culture. And culture is what we make, and we change it all the time. So culture has no stability. We're supposed to be the stability, right? For each other, like the anchor and the lighthouse in the dark, and the counterbalance and the support for each other. But we no longer know how to do that. We no longer know like what's expected of us. So my basic rules, if I put aside the great history of it all, are that in today's moment, men and women are equal and should be equal in every way. That's what feminism asks of us. So unless we agree otherwise, men and women are equal, should not have to pay for each other, should not have to beg each other, and should not have to lie and cheat and kiss us and pretend to each other. Throughout all of the exchanges of like flirtation, friendship with benefits, love, insane love and lust, infatuation, and all the rest of it. When the power dynamics and the dynamics of conquest come in, should only be what it actually is in nature when the issue of procreation comes in. So until both parties, or at least until the mother, is ready to become a mother, it's not an issue. We really, as feminist women, and we really, as feminist males, or trans men, or trans women, or whatever one's favorite, pronoun and orientation is, we do not have to differentiate our roles at all. In a world that has already, about 70 years ago, separated sex from procreation. So let me say that again. Sometime in the middle of the 20th century, we, the patriarchs, the patriarchy, not necessarily we, but the powers that be, separated for all intents and purposes legally as well as practically sex from procreation. And that was the reason of being for the patriarchy. So whether it's with birth control or paternity tests, which are so quick and easy and cheap right now, or with different techniques of artificial insemination, all kinds of like reproduction through a lab, gestational carriers, divorce, the prevalence of divorce and divorce law as it has grown since then, the legality of same-sex marriage, and a lot of other, changes. Of course, abortion is a constitutional right. We have clearly separated sex from procreation. And let me kind of unpack that a little bit. The patriarchy begins because man has to go to woman to have a genetic future, to live, to exist. So without that, there is no such thing as the entire construct of civilization as we know it. The good of it and the bad of it, the terrible beauty of it, right? So I would simplify things by saying that in our ancient ancestors, at some point, Homo sapiens or before, came to the knowledge, that first procreative knowledge, that it wasn't simply woman making babies, but it was woman being inseminated by the male, making babies, and lo and behold, it's one baby per pregnancy. It's one father per pregnancy, which is a pretty extraordinary understanding for primitive, as we like to call it, ancestral people to comprehend that even though a woman in the wild could have sex with 20 partners in her last cycle, only one of those men is the actual father of the child that she's birthing. So until then, basically, procreation was the realm of women, and that's why so much of the earliest signs of our understanding of worship, divinity, art, and all the other kind of human expression on cave walls, or that we have found and we have attempted to translate into our patriarchal and words and meanings. They all show the woman, the fertile woman, the fertilized woman, the woman in propagation or about to propagate, right? So that's has always been the ultimate mystery of life, because that has always been the ultimate goal of life in nature, to go on. That's our most basic instinct, and it's also our only difference in nature. Nature doesn't really recognize or care for all of our other potential minor differences, which now we call cultural differences, but nature does care about the procreative future, the procreators and non-procreators, let's call them, which is the people who have the potential to become mothers and the people who don't. And we're all born as non-procreators, and if we don't have children, we spend our whole life as non-procreators. So calling a woman a mother is a misnomer, and it doesn't quite describe what's involved. A woman who has a functional womb is merely a potential procreator, which really practically means nothing in nature, to nature. So until the onset of menstruation, when the potential for procreation begins, and going on until menopause, when that functionality ends, is completed, that is the brief period when some of us are potential procreators, but we really aren't procreators until we have conceived. And in the modern era, we also have decided to have a child, right? So ancient men, back to ancient men, tens of thousands of years ago, is kind of left outside. You know, that warmth and all that like love activity and the fascination of the woman who was like in heat and crazy for him, but she's now crazy for this child, and she's, you know, programmed by nature to do everything for the child and die for the child. And in exchange, that child who was inside her, feeding off of her, you know, is out and is just like completely focused on her for survival, and eats off of her body and kind of learns from her by staring at her at first, right? So, and we don't know what sounds or languages there were then, but what we can guess is that men left a sort of felt a sort of procreative envy and felt left out, you know, was left out of that kind of like magical circle duality of the two. And the way to break into that and share in that kind of like family, in that huddling that could be, you know, long term, the only way to do that would be to acquire that extraordinary knowledge that would allow him to say, I belong here somehow, you know, even though his procreative job, you know, literally speaking, is the quick unconscious insemination, you know, one ejaculation, and it's over, his job's over. You know, she may conceive 2 weeks later, and then the hard work of, you know, building a human from one's body and then splitting one's body open to become two or more out of being one begins, you know, and then having that life depend on nourishment from the mother's body. It goes on and on, you know, the raising of the young. In our current era, we have made a very big part for fatherhood, and we can keep that or not as we want, but when it comes to nature, the job of fatherhood kind of like ended with insemination, with ejaculation. But once father guessed or understood that this child may look like him, this child may be him, maybe his, he made himself of use by creating, you know, providing shelter or going and getting like big game to give the mother meat to help her with like, you know, having the pregnancy or having milk, all that stuff that we assume, we don't know 100%, but we assume came with that type of knowledge. And from that original knowledge of like one pregnancy, one inseminator, comes the basic concept, the original concept of the patriarchy, which was if we could just, we men, could just have a womb exclusively from like virginity until menopause, each man to himself, like one womb per man. If a man could conjugate a womb and keep it, no matter what it cost to him, it would be great, because in exchange he would have access to a genetic future, and a way to pass on not just his genes but his essence, his sense of himself in the world, for whatever that meant back then. And that's how we very slowly, because all these things happen slowly, even though change seems to be quick, come into the creation of patriarchal societies sometime around 7000 BC, 6000 BC. A lot of it coincides with the beginning of the agrarian era, because our ancestors stopped being nomadic, kind of like adapting to the weather and moving from place to place where, you know, they could like find fruits or harvest or big game or small game, water, all of that, as they decided to kind of settle. And I'm not sure that the two decisions were not connected, that the idea of possessing womb was not the imperative, the impetus for kind of settling roots, which facilitated what we call the patriarchy, right? Because stability made it easier to kind of watch the activity of a procreative woman, of a woman during her fertile years. And so we kind of know, I'm not going to go into it now, we kind of know where all of that led. It did lead to the creation of trade and money and hierarchies of authority, and a type of domestication of the fertile feminine, legally and financially, which only in recent years, maybe the last, 2 millennia or less, it began to slowly kind of unravel again, and partly because fathers wanted to give their own daughters, who until their daughters became, menstruating women, seemed to them equal, wanted to give them an education and give them more rights. So, but in the process of everything that civilization created, every development, every invention, every extraordinary knowledge that we've achieved, every new thinking, in the process of all of that, the patriarchy, dynastic control, familial longevity, generational wealth and power kept going, kept incentivizing their perpetuation. And so here we find ourselves in the middle of the 20th century, and we have World War II, which was humanity's first realization that it could suicide. It could really kind of like kill itself as a result of this kind of like big dynastic fights between, men in charge, dictatorial men in charge, right? So there was a moment of reckoning, a long moment of a complicated reckoning among the survivors of World War II. And it resulted in a lot of what has happened now, including the digital life, which makes it less likely that we nuke each other to extinction, and our cyber warfare, which again makes it less likely that we will, destroy millions of non-combatants by dropping nukes and whatever. But in the process also of the same progress, patriarchy, I call it, solved the mystery of procreation. So our scientists who had invented the bomb, kind of the same type of people, understood the genetic sequencing was there and began to unravel it. And in the same way, and I'm not going to go into the scientific information because this is not my specialty, in the same way that they found the key to paternity, to that ultimate knowledge that used to be the knowledge only of the mother, and which made the father, or men in general, existentially insecure, because really, even if he thought he had, locked her up, it was always possible that she had, done something he didn't know about, and he was raising another man's child. It was always possible, and women were trained by their mothers and elders to keep the secrets at all costs, and men were raised with this sort of like procreative insecurity, right? Which made the genders distrust one another. And then we have the sexual revolution, which is not accidentally, but completely a result of the scientific revolution and progress. So just as we get access to functioning birth control for women to use. We have the sexual revolution. And then we have, different ways of dealing with infertility. And again, it's a slow process that involves different forms of IVF. And then at the same time, pretty much, the interest in like gender surgery, basically, begins. And there is a lot of kind of opening up and experimentation about reassignment therapy, whether with hormones or with medical intervention. All of that is a result of the fact that patriarchy has lost its reason for being, its raison d'etre. If we know who the father is, like what's the reason for all of these rules and regulations and constructs and all these complicated ways we've come up with for men to convince women to choose them? Pick me, I'm like the richest one, the strongest one, the best one, and once you pick me, that's it for life. So marriage also, as it used to be for many generations who had no choice, and if they were wealthy or sneaky, maybe they would have some other avenues for sexual experimentation, but they were trying really hard to stick to that one official partner for procreation, whether that partner was picked for them by their parents or by their tribe or by the elders or by custom or by the matchmaker, or whether in more recent years that partner was picked somewhat also blindly by, romantic impulse, right? And we do have countless romantic urges through our lives, but, there was a period where like the earliest one was the one we had to stick to. And that was before the middle of the 20th century with Romanticism. So that's kind of like a very, very quick summary of how we get to this moment in post-patriarchy, and how what we call feminism has been a way, in fact, to perpetuate the dynamic of non-procreators controlling procreators. And what do I mean by that? I mean that the people who do not do the work of getting pregnant, giving birth, breastfeeding, potty training, teaching how to crawl, teaching how to speak, all of the really basic work of motherhood, are usually the people who must financially support the person who does that. So it could be a husband, it could be a father of the bride, of the mother, or so through like inheritance or some other sort of wealth. But nevertheless, procreative sex is still a privatized economy. It's an economy of dependency. The mother is still dependent on someone to kind of guarantee her financial support and that of her child for as long as necessary, right? So we are, even though we've separated sex from procreation, we are perpetuating those old-ass dynamics of culturally selecting the richest, the loudest, and not necessarily the best fit for a long-term relationship as a father or a mother for our children. We go a lot by like what people will think or what it looks on paper like is the best option, which is very cynical because we're speaking the words of love and commitment, but in the background of our minds, this reality, this financial reality is there, looming. And for men, it feels like a moral debt. It feels like if a woman actually has my child, it is my debt to be betrothed to her, I am beholden to her, and I have to pay for it. It will cost me. It has to cost me, right? That's the feeling. And for women, again, what comes up is that as feminist as you may be, and as equal as you may be in your career, in your education, and in your life choices, there is that kind of like unspoken feeling that, I'm screaming here in pain, and my body's breaking up, and you are getting to put your name on the birth certificate, and you are getting to share half of the right of kind of like legally owning this new person. So you owe me, right? And that's where the whole messed up confusion about who pays for whom and what men, women are doing in love, in sex, and in dating becomes so confused. The way to unconfuse it is to separate motherhood and fatherhood, which is a more optional category, motherhood and fatherhood, from womanhood and manhood, and from our sexual anatomies and our sexual proclivities and choices and paths and journeys. And to be able to speak up that truth, to understand it conceptually first in our minds, so that we can begin to have these conversations with the people we're attracted to, and the people we fall in love with, and the people we want to spend a lot of time with, and then the people we may want to have babies with, which don't have to be the same categories. So the first task would be to actually begin to separate the expectation of like, I want to be with you, I want to touch you, I want to smell you. I'm obsessing about you. I'm so psychochemically attracted to you that like right now nothing else matters. You're it right now. We have to separate that from, I want you to be the parent of my child. I want you to bring my child to this world and raise her or him. Or I want to bring your child to this world and raise him and her with you. Those are two different categories. And understanding the difference between sex, love, dating, flirting, and motherhood, fatherhood, procreation, and separating the two legally, as well as morally, as well as socially in our daily lives, is what we need to do in order to move forward into this 21st century without losing our minds. And I do feel that a lot of the confusion about a lot of other things, whether it is politics and vaccines or like gender identification, stem from that very deep, primal, procreative confusion that we're in. So I would say there's a lot more to say about this, but I would say that kind of understanding that for ourselves as we meet people, as we date people, and speaking of it in a way that is inclusive, loving, accepting, and not alienating. Finding a way to say, I love you, I want to be with you, I don't want to be the mother or the father of your child. And also us answering that question for ourselves. Do we want to be a mother or a father? With whom? Or if we want to be with anyone? And if it's something that we want to do differently, then that is the topic for my next video, which is on universal mother income, which is basically what I think is the next step for us to do as a nation, as a culture, as a global culture, and that is to create an option for mothers to choose to have a child without the dependency which could be a lie, without the forced dependency on a partner who may or may not want to be in it. And that option, which I call universal mother income, and I have kind of like a whole platform for how it would work, I think is necessary if we actually do mean my body, my choice, if we do mean the right of a woman to be pregnant or not. Because pregnancy is not just pregnancy, it also includes birth and raising, and all of this includes money and a sense of one's independence and freedom in the world. And especially for women who only recently earned the right to have careers and to be promoted and to be paid more or less equitably, and to make a place for themselves in the world, in a world that's deeply masculinized. It's a very, very difficult decision and choice to make. It feels like a very self-denying, and it is selfless, decision to make. So how do we explain that and optimize that? But as I said, that's another topic. For now, I just would like to give this introduction of how we can begin to separate sex from procreation, especially when it comes to our transactions and our relationship of sex and money. That's it. Love you. And until next week, keep speaking sex.